My name is Clemency Cooper, and I'm the Community Archaeology Manager for Oxford Archaeology, undertaking the excavations on behalf of Balfour Beatty and Highways England in Hull. While we move our camera behind the scenes to our osteology lab to meet some of our experts and find out more about what we've discovered on site so far, I'm going to introduce you to our three presenters and our host for the remainder of the webinar. The first of our three presentations will come from Jessica Waters, one of our osteology supervisors. She will be looking at examples of both orthopaedic and fashionable corset use in the population we found at Hull Trinity Burial Ground. Our second presentation will be given by osteology supervisor Katie Dolman. You might have seen from our website and our previous webinar that we discovered a mystery bottle labelled Hull Infirmary, and Katie is going to give us some further information about the contents of the mystery bottle and what it might mean. And finally, we have Dave Henderson, one of our osteology project officers, doing a more in-depth analysis of one of the skeletons that we found on site, a possible victim of the Union steam packet explosion. As our three presenters will be talking about different topics, we will address questions to each of them in turn at the end of their talks. Please make sure to post your questions to the presenters in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen as we go along. Dr. Lauren McIntyre, one of the lead osteologists also working at Trinity Burial Ground, you might have met her at our first webinar. She will be our host in the lab, posing questions to the presenters. If we don't have time to address all of the questions, we will make a note and answer them on our project webpage in the coming weeks. If you have general questions about the Trinity Burial Ground excavation, please make sure to go back and watch the recordings from our first webinar if you haven't already, or get in touch via email on our webpage. We have an online feedback form for this webinar, and the link is in the chat box, which is separate to the Q&A. Please make sure to make a note of this link to our online feedback form, copy and paste it into your browser to complete after the webinar. A final few housekeeping points, just a reminder that we will be showing human skeletal remains. Also, these presentations are being filmed live on site, so please forgive us any small technical hiccups as we try to share this view behind the scenes with you. I can recommend turning up the volume on your device and using headphones if you have them to hand. So please make sure to subscribe for email updates on our website to keep track of those. So I think we're now ready. We've got our camera back in the lab behind the scenes at the tent at Trinity Burial Ground, and I will pass over to our team there.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jess. I'm one of the osteologists here at Trinity Street Burial Ground, and today I'm going to talk to you about orthopaedic bracing and corsetry examples from the site here. So the first skeleton we're going to look at is skeleton number 14330. It is the skeleton of the probable male. The pelvis and the skull, some of these bones are fractured, and so there is some level of doubt about the biological sex of this individual. And we think they're in the 45 plus category for age. What's interesting about this individual is they've got a condition called Sherman's disease, which is a juvenile form of kyphosis, which is where the skull orientates towards the front, so they've got almost a hunched appearance. And this happens when they're developing as an adolescent and up into their teenage years, and causes a few changes on the bones, but also this individual has had changes on the bones caused by bracing. So we've got up here some examples of historical bracing that might have been used to correct the forward tilt of the spine. So this is a modern Milwaukee spinal brace, which is used for kyphosis and scoliosis. So kyphosis is when your spine leans forward, and scoliosis is when it leans over to one side. These are some more historical examples, some of which might have been similar to what this individual might have been wearing. As you can see, there's a lot of metal involved, some leather, lots of binding material to basically force the spine to conform to a certain way. So let's have a look at what impact not only the disease, but also potentially the bracing has had on this individual. So most notably, you can see the shape of the ribs have been changed. They've almost got a 90-degree angle and are facing straight forward, whereas a normal rib should have a nice barrel-like curve that's very regular, starting at the spine, going forward, right to the chest. And this creates a nice space for the lungs and internal organs to sit nicely within the cavity of the chest. So with this change, you can see where the angle has been completely altered. And if we have a look at the ribs on the table, you can see they've all got this very uniform, almost right angle on both the left and the right side. Now, kyphosis, as I said, causes the spine to go forward. And you can see that on the vertebra, they've got almost a pinched appearance and they've gone quite thin, whereas a normal vertebra will be nice and blocked and squared. So you can see now how the bend might have started in the spine. So Sherman's disease starts when they're an adolescent, so they would have been quite young at the time, and gradually it will develop. Modern cases are treated with things like physiotherapy, sometimes surgery, but also orthopedic bracing. Obviously, at the time we're looking at, the kind of mid-1700s to mid-1800s, surgery wasn't really a viable option because of the risk of infection, issues around anesthesia, and also just doing further damage because obviously you'd be working within the space of the spine, so you'd be looking at nerve damage potentials, etc. So Sherman's disease isn't fatal. It will potentially have been quite uncomfortable, but we won't know for sure. It would have caused potentially some tiredness, obviously some back pain because your spine is going forward. Potentially if your curve was really, really bad, you might have suffered from shortness of breath because obviously your lungs are being slightly compressed. But we can't tell how painful this would have been. This individual would have had this for as long as they could remember, really. And because they lived well into their 40s, they obviously were able to survive with it, but we don't know for sure how bad their pain level would have been. So what else would this have caused? Sherman's disease causes these little bony outgrowths on the spinal vertebra. So you can see these little lipping, almost frilly looks to the edges of the vertebra. These are called osteophytes. And these are bits of bone that gradually develop over time. They're little bony deposits, but obviously it creates an issue when they start to overlap and interact. So it could lead in the long term to conditions like osteoarthritis, which would again probably have made their back feel a lot sorer than their condition. You also get compressions of the intervertebral disc, which cause these little lesions on the center of the vertebra called Schmall's nodes. These little lesions are little hemorrhages of the intervertebral disc, and again, probably would have been quite painful, but we can't 100% know how painful this would have been for this person. The condition, Sherman's disease, is named after Holger Werfel Sherman, and it was developed and he recorded it in the early 1910s, so it wouldn't have been called Sherman's disease when this individual had it when they were alive. So that's kind of a medical example of a break. So corsets, which were worn by women and men sometimes, were a fashionable piece. So this individual is a lot younger. So this individual is 18 to 25 years old. And as you can see, the ribs have got a curve, but it's a very sharp curve. And the ends of the ribs are tapered. That's not a normal way for a rib. If we get one of our other ribs, our plastic ones, you can see it kind of is a nice symmetrical shape the whole way along. So again, corsets cause deformities to the ribs because they're designed to create an hourglass-like figure. If we look at some of the examples on the board, we've got these really tight bindings that create this very, very small waist. And this is Mr. Pearl, a modern corset designer. And as you can see, he's created a very, very small waist. And that was done through the use of boning, either metal or animal whale, mostly whalebone, were used to create a constriction of the torso. This is quite a graphic cartoon, which is roughly contemporary with the time that we're looking at. And you can see death is there, creating the woman's cinched figure. And it was quite common for women to suffer from shortness of breath, because the tight cinching of a corset would create the lungs would be compressed quite a lot. If we go back and look at our young lady, her ribs are obviously already quite changed by her wearing of corset. and she's only 18 to 25. She probably would have been wearing a corset from the age of maybe 10 or 11. And she would have carried on wearing one for her whole life. There was a special maternity corset for pregnant women, which would have been, again, quite graphic, and they would have been designed to constrict the body. So this lady, while she's very young, is still exhibiting some changes, and they would have got worse most likely as she got older. And there are some medical complications associated with corsetry. For example, we talked about the breathlessness issue, but it can also cause things like stomach problems and digestive issues because the organs are being so rigidly compressed. It can also cause things like bladder incontinence. All these things, because the organs being so heavily constricted and pushed into such a small space, can make it actually quite difficult for women to function. And there were instances of women collapsing because they were so short of breath. So maybe our image of death lacing up a corset isn't 100% fit. I guess now we can go to any questions about our skeleton or our skeletons.
Hi there. We haven't had any questions about corsetry so far, but if anybody does have any, please do type them into the Q&A, then I'll be able to read them out now. We did have one question that Clem might be able to answer. She can switch her mic back on. Sally has asked whereabouts the recordings of this session will be put online for people to access.
Hello there, it's Clem here again. So we've been asked about the recordings for today's webinar. We will be posting those in instalment on the Highways England archaeology webpage for A63 Castle Street project. The link is in our chat box. I will post it in there again. So please make sure to make a copy of that. If you want to hear about our latest updates from the site, I can recommend subscribing to email notifications for that website. I'll hand back over to Lauren and to Jess back in the lab.
We've had a question come through. Okay, so anonymous attendee has asked, would individuals be buried in their corsets?
So it'd be very unlikely for them to be buried in their corsets because they would be worth quite a lot of money because there's a lot of fabric involved and there was a lot of recycling of clothing in this time. Even if the clothing was quite badly damaged after years and years of wear, it would have been cut down into its component parts such as the silks, the linings, the cottons, the metals and the boning, and those would have been recycled into making new corsets or other clothing garments. Also, potentially it would have made them it would have been not very pleasant for them to be buried in their corsets or their bindings because it would make them very, very stiff, and obviously the undertaker would need to be able to manoeuvre the body into a coffin.
I think I can probably add to that as well, that most of the people that we excavated on the site, we have found some evidence of clothing in terms of things like buttons. We've had a lot of buttons made out of wood and shell and so on, but we haven't been able to tell yet whether these are actually from clothing per se or whether they're from things like shrouds. So this is going to be something that we'll look into in process. We'll look at things like the positions of the buttons, so whereabouts around the body they're found. And so that might be something we can elaborate on a little bit more later on.